Welcome to the European Parliamentary Research Service podcast on ending poverty in the world.
More than a quarter of the world's population lives in poverty. That's why erasing it is the first of 17 goals the UN has set in its 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda.
Poverty eradication is also a priority for the EU. But how do we go about this enormous challenge? And are we well on track to achieve our goals? Stay with us.
Let's start by throwing in some data. In 2015, 736 million people, that's 10% of the world's population, lived in extreme poverty. That means surviving on less than $1.9 per day. In the same year, nearly half the world lived on less than $5.5 per day, the international poverty line for lower and upper middle income countries.
Now, appalling as they still are, if we compare these figures with figures from the 1990s, we'd have to conclude that global poverty rates have been falling at an unprecedented pace over the past 2 decades. But billions around the world are still struggling to meet basic needs.
And unless there's a serious policy shift, about 6% of the world's population, most of them in Africa, will remain in extreme poverty in 2030, which makes the achievement of the first Sustainable Development Goal a major global challenge.
Besides this, inequalities are also rising. Consider another figure. Today, the world's 26th richest people own as much as the 3.8 billion poorest people in the world.
But what causes poverty? Let's have a look.
Defined by the World Bank as pronounced deprivation of well-being, poverty has many sides to it and multiple causes. At regional and national level, nature and climate are key factors. Areas affected by droughts or annual floods, for example, are more affected by food insecurity and poverty levels.
Conflict and insecurity, another 2 powerful drivers of poverty, are also often endemic in countries suffering from natural catastrophes. At the same time, bad governance and generalised corruption also hamper anti-poverty measures and underpin a vicious circle linking lack of trust in the state to poor growth, exclusion and poverty.
At the household and individual level, poverty is more often linked to questions of family structure, gender, education levels and employment. Actually, UNESCO estimates that if adults in developing countries were to receive just 2 more years of schooling or to complete secondary school, nearly 60 million people will be lifted out of poverty. So education is really a crucial factor.
Yes, it is. So what are we doing to fight poverty?
Well, anti-poverty strategies are often a mix of immediate relief measures and long-term strategies focused on economic growth. So it's both giving someone a fish and teaching them to fish. But it's also improving the condition of the river so there are more fish in it.
Actually, evidence confirms that economic growth is indeed a necessary condition for long-term poverty reduction. But if we want people to enjoy the benefits of this economic growth, it is equally important to tackle inequality, social exclusion and discrimination, for instance by investing in education and healthcare.
Social protection measures such as retirement benefits and child benefits, but also social safety nets and basic public services such as access to clean water and sanitation also have a key role to play in fighting poverty and promoting social inclusion.
Now, poverty eradication is an ongoing objective of EU development policy and has recently gained momentum with the incorporation of the Sustainable Development Goals into the 2017 European Consensus on Development. Now, what is this exactly?
It's basically the framework for EU and member states' actions in the area of development cooperation and the blueprint which aligns the Union's development policy with the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development.
So want to know what the EU is doing to tackle poverty and address its root causes? Stay with us.
The EU supports through its different instruments and programmes key areas such as education, healthcare, social protection and good governance relevant to poverty eradication in developing countries.
Improving the resilience in particular of the poorest segment of the population in fragile and conflict-affected states to climate, economic and other shocks and disasters is another key objective of EU development and humanitarian action.
The EU is also an important provider of aid for trade that aims to help partner countries build the necessary trade capacity and infrastructure to reap the full benefits of trade liberalisation and to promote economic growth.
In addition, with the grants and guarantees channeled through the European Fund for Sustainable Development, the EU is trying to mobilise the massive public and private investment necessary for the economic takeoff of the continent, which would provide jobs and access to basic services for the growing African population.
Now, some doubt that using the aid to subsidise private investment is the best way to tackle poverty and insist on the need for strict implementation of development objectives, environmental and social standards, and on highlighting human rights in all projects.
Others also denounce the diversion of aid to finance migration management in countries of origin and transit of migration from Africa to Europe, which creates the impression that the European Fund for Sustainable Development is being used to finance a fortress Europe.
What's clear is that a coherent and integrated management of the EU external and internal policies is a key challenge that needs to be addressed in order to achieve the sustainable development goals in Europe and to support their implementation worldwide.
Furthermore, a shift from the current inclusive growth towards a post-growth economy, measured by the well-being of people and the planet instead of GDP, is perceived by many as a radical long-term solution to ensure a sustainable future for all.
You're listening to the European Parliamentary Research Service podcasts.